Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be my first Matchday 1 first draft for the Euros, and it's obviously our first video as well for this 2024 version of an international fantasy game. Here, I think what's interesting with the Euros is that we do have different rules compared to the World Cup. If you have played, for example, Champions League Fantasy, if you have played even the previous iteration of Euros Fantasy, where you might have actually watched the content last time around as well, you know that the rules are very similar. And so very different to the World Cup. You don't have to worry about that. The game is already live. It's launched. So you can obviously create your team now. However, of course, at the time of recording this video, a couple international teams still have their provisional squads to be submitted. For example, Spain and Netherlands at the time of recording this video still don't have their squad, although we're going to be picking players that I think will be fairly nailed, and we don't have to run into that sort of concern unless some last minute injuries come about. Anyways, in terms of Matchday 1, I think it's worth to talk about the fixtures first, because in my opinion, from a strategic point of view, we really have two overriding chips in this fantasy game, right? We have one, the wild card chip, which allows you to effectively change your team completely and you have to sort of maintain that team, or two, the limitless chip, which is obviously the free hit chip on steroids, which means that effectively you have a free hit chip, a budgetless cap. And what's interesting, of course, is as we know with international tournaments, usually what happens in match day 3 is that a lot of things will be thrown into the spanners. Now, the interesting thing about the Euros, of course, is that I think a lot of teams will still have something to fight for in terms of match day 3, but it's very unlikely that all the teams will have something to fight for, right? There might be some teams that will have 2 wins already. Their position in the group could be rather secure. And so you have these consequences where some players get benched, some people get rotated, and therefore it's useful to have a chip to sort of reset your team once again. What usually people do is something like wildcard match day 2 and limitless match day 3. This effectively means that you get to free hit the entire match days. And then, of course, by match day 4, when we hit the knockout stage of the tournament, you get a wild card anyways. That's sort of, created by the game. So we have unlimited transfers once again. So because we don't really expect major upsets in match day 4 when we have the knockout round of the tournament, usually what happens is you're necessitated to use your chips early on. And of course, last time around with the Euros, if you guys remember, Netherlands were a huge upset. I think a lot of us stacked up on 4 Netherlands players, but it's very unlikely that we're going to have enough upsets really to warrant holding off your wild card to match day 4, although it can be an alternative piece of strategy. So my first draft, however, will be assuming that I will be doing that sort of free hit strategy effectively by using the wild card and the limitless by match day 2 and 3 respectively. So with match day 1, of course, all we're going to focus on are the match day 1 games. If you have a different strategy, of course, it's worth thinking about whether you want to sort of metagame the tournament. You're hoping for upsets, and therefore you can hold on to your wild card. And so maybe you might want to plan, for example, match day 1 and 2 together, and then you could throw in your limitless in match day 3. That could be something to think about. The way I see it, though, with match day 1 is that I'm still going to free hit, and I think it's a good chance to do so. In terms of all the sort of big matchups we have, I think Italy versus Albania is one of the worst or the most one-sided on paper games. We have Italy ultimately a big tournament contender, not exactly this time around a favorite considering they actually won last time around, but still you have Albania, who's a very inferior team, unfortunately, in a very strong group where Spain and Croatia are also within that group, but Italy have that match day 1 game. And if you look at the clean sheet odds, even per the bookies, or even my friend 11ify, who's actually sharing his sort of data model, and he'll be spreading, for example, his own odds in terms of team strengths based on clean sheets, and you'll have your predicted goals as well for each team, and you can see it on the link in the description, so feel free to check that out. But effectively, Italy versus Albania has the best clean sheet odds, so I am minded, for example, here in this situation, to go for probably double Italy defense. Spain versus Croatia, not exactly a great game, but potentially decent for Spain from an attacking point of view. Croatia, obviously one of the better teams within this group, so not exactly a great game for Spain. So from a match day 1 perspective, not that keen on their assets. And if I do spend on their assets, it's for cheaper ones. Hungary versus Switzerland is not bad, because I think these are both teams where you'd expect for them to be weaker teams, within the context of the tournament, but you have some key players within Shaqiri and Szoboszlai here that could be interesting. Am I that interested in them? Not really, to be quite honest. As far as Poland versus Netherlands, this is obviously a very good one-sided matchup for the Netherlands, because the group in of itself is very tough for the Netherlands, But you have players like Xavi Simons who are actually very cheap, so I actually quite like him. And then, of course, if you can get access to a Dutch defender who's very, very cheap, that's another possibility as well. Not too bad of game. Slovenia versus Denmark, a perfect game for the people who like, the Melas of the world, the strong defenders. I mean, he's been always a classic international fantasy god, to be quite honest. If you guys remember last time around the Euros, he was absolutely categorically one of the best assets that we could have, but he was also underpriced. This time around, he is a little bit overpriced, but I would say for the context of Matchday 1, still very, very strong. Serbia versus England is an interesting one because I think Serbia, if we can give them credit as an international team, it's the fact that their offense is very strong. When you look at the team on paper, right, even in the midfield and of course in the attacking positions, these are players who obviously play top flight football. So if anything, I'd say this is a pretty bad opportunity, I would say, to jump and maybe double up on the English defense, even though I would say England are coming into this tournament as one of the better defensive teams and obviously offensive teams as well. I think we probably view them as maybe the overall favorites for the tournament, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're the best team to invest into for Matchday 1 from a defending perspective. I kind of like the attacking assets from England here, and especially since Serbia isn't particularly good of a defensive team. And then the last set of games in terms of Matchday 1 that I think are interesting, of course, are Portugal versus Czech Republic. That's obviously very one-sided. Romania versus Ukraine, it's not particularly interesting, but it probably allows you to go for some of these Ukrainian picks who are probably a little bit underpriced in the context of that. Players like Dovbyk and even, Sigankov, who actually plays or who both play for Girona in La Liga are very good assets to kind of go with. Zinchenko, I would say probably not so interesting, although he plays a much more attacking role for Ukraine as well. So that's worth mentioning. As far as Belgium or Slovakia, insanely one-sided game once again. So I think that should be quite favoring to Belgium. Austria versus France is interesting because I think France, we just see them as another powerhouse, very much like England. So I would take an opportunity here to probably go into, once again, the French attackers as opposed to the French defenders, because I'd still say that Austria are a pretty competent team and they could actually surprise. Turkey versus Georgia, though, is a great game because Georgia, I think we once again see, similar to Albania, as a pretty poor team in the tournament. So if you're looking at, let's say, cheap picks to round out your MD1 team, you've got your Turkish assets there who can do very well for you. And then once again, just going back to Portugal versus Czech Republic, you do have some big hitters in Portugal, but they're also quite expensive. So what you kind of have to decide between is obviously whether you go for the big hitters in England, Germany, or even France, or maybe even Netherlands if you want to put them as big hitters, and then consider who has to be dropped off in Matchday 1 here, because I'd say Portugal still, all in all, have a good game. And that's sort of my take on the fixtures. We're only looking at Matchday 1, of course, keep in mind, because of the strategy that I'm planning to go with. We're just going to be basically free hitting here with Matchday 1. When I actually look at the sort of clean sheet odds from my friend 11ify, and you can see obviously all the odds on his website with his sort of team predictions, he basically categorically, I would say, recommends Italy defense right now. Obviously, the numbers right now are in a beta phase, right? We still have, first of all, squads to be submitted. We need to know how the squads are sort of finalized, whether there's any injuries, and of course, things can change before the tournament that make us change our opinions on certain things, and therefore, of course, his predictions will change too, and it's live. However, of course, when we go back to clean sheets, what's lovely, of course, is Italy 60%, very, very far clear. Germany, Netherlands, Belgium, Denmark, all up there as well, with above 40% clean sheet odds. Same with Turkey and France. So these are, in my opinion, the teams to look at. Although, of course, you have some cheaper goalkeepers as well, like, for example, the Ukrainian goalkeeper in Andrei Lunin from Real Madrid, who could be quite interesting given the sort of price point that you're given, right? Because, of course, the Danish goalkeeper is going to be a little bit more expensive, so on and so forth. So, take that as well into your consideration. As far as attack, though, I think it's very, very stock standard, the way attack is being driven in terms of the predicted goals from Matchday 1. All the big hitters are there: England, France, Germany, Belgium, Portugal, all sorts. And so, in my opinion, I think it does make sense to probably invest into these sorts of teams. Portugal, Spain, Italy, not too far off as well. But if you're venturing a little bit further away from these teams, it's probably not advisable, I would say. Maybe, of course, Netherlands, not too bad. Turkey as well, just given that they have cheaper assets, and we'll talk about them in a moment. But for example, when you go into the Ukraines, the Hungaries of this tournament, I'd say I'd probably still stay away from them, even though they have some pretty talismanic players. And I think that's fair enough if you want to go for some differentials too. So with my draft, let's actually quickly head on over to it. And let's just start, just like we do with any odd fantasy game, with the defense, right? I talked about the clean sheet odds, and I think that's a good segue into the defense. I think that with international tournaments, what's nice about the Euro game too is that you get so well rewarded for being a defender, because you get all these bonus points for all the sort of small interactions that you participate in within the game. So you're not only like an FPL defender where really you're just looking for a clean sheet, and attacking returns are very sparse. With international tournaments as well, I'd say that predicted goals, particularly from the larger teams, are usually better. We tend to see, of course, attacking defenders pop off a little bit more, if I'm being completely honest. And Mela is such a good example of that, going back to the previous tournament. So the way that I'm actually laying out my defense is I'm going double Germany defense, because in my opinion, these German defenders are way too cheap. Jonathan Tah, in my opinion, should start for Scotland. Mittelstadt as well should start. Keep in mind that since Toni Kroos came into the German squad, we started to see a little bit of a difference in terms of the formation. Yes, of course, we've seen Havertz at left back before, but I don't really think that Mittelstadt will really have much competition in the spot. It's really David Raum who will actually be competing here, but I think it's very clear that Nagelsmann does prefer him. So because you have access to a 4.5 and 4 million German defender with great clean sheet odds in Matchday 1, I really can't shy away from that. Then, of course, capturing the fact that we have amazing clean sheet odds for Italy, I'd also like to double up on the Italian defense. So we're going with Di Lorenzo and Di Marco as well. So these are the two players that I think, first of all, when you look at club level, are very attacking. Di Marco at times, of course, plays almost like a winger at times for Inter Milan. I just think that these are going to be the go-to picks here for Matchday 1, hopefully as a little bit of a punt. And then Mela, given the fact that he actually has such a great game for Denmark, and of course he just traditionally plays in an extremely attacking role within this Danish setup, I just think that I'd like to go for him over, let's say, maybe an English player at this moment in time. And that's simply because we're just targeting Matchday 1 here. Nothing else, nothing more. In the goalkeeping positions, we're going to go with Andre Lunin and the Turkish goalkeeper. I apologize in advance. I'm going to say his name probably completely wrong. Sakir or Kakir, I'm not really sure. Apologies, of course, but we're going to go with that. These are cheaper goalkeepers, and I think ultimately when you look at goalkeepers, first of all, the clean sheet odds actually for these two teams are quite high. And another thing to mention too with international tournaments is, of course, yes, players like Diogo Costa and Pickford are going to be better. I think they play for much stronger defenses, but looking at the matchups here, Georgia and Romania, of course, I really don't think that there's a need to really pass up an opportunity and at getting access to great goalkeepers here. You might not want to go for example, the Zinchenkos of the worlds, or even a Turkish sort of fullback, but I still think that these are great picks to go with at this moment in time. So therefore, we're sort of solidifying our defense for Matchday 1 with some really expensive picks in the fullback positions, but then also trying to save a little bit of cash with the goalkeepers. And then in the midfield, if we quickly shift on over there, we're going to go with some big hitters and then some cheap players. And I'll explain the sort of reasoning for the cheap picks. But also it's because we're trying to funnel as much money as possible into the attackers, because it also allows us to sort of gamble on and have the best captaincies, as well as obviously have the best goal scorers with the best goal scoring odds. Yes, of course, midfielders get more points for scoring a goal in fantasy games, like even, for example, Euro 2024. But as we tend to see with international tournaments, having pen takers is very important. Having players who are clearly going to be permanent fixtures for their teams is very important. And I think that's why we've decided to spend as much money as possible into the forward positions, as opposed to spending all our money within the midfield, where I think clearly one of the big players, or two big players that I'm clearly missing in the midfield, are De Bruyne and Bruno Fernandes. But you really have to pick and choose which sort of premium players you're going with. And I tend to like the premium players who are going to be penalty takers as well. Hence why we're going to spend more money in the forward position. But without further ado, the midfield is Saka, Gundogan, Xavi Simons, Rodri, and also Çalhanoğlu from Inter Milan as well. Saka, of course, I think has been a mainstay for this English national team. He's a very attacking player. When we watch him play in international tournaments, I think it's also a little bit easier for him, arguably. The quality of the defenders that he's usually up against is definitely a little bit inferior to club level. And we do see Saka, for example, very much enjoy himself. I mean, even in tough games, quote unquote, like, for example, in the France game, you can see he is a constant threat for this English team. Very much like Arsenal, of course, the English team does play through Saka as well. Given the fact that I think, especially with, let's say, Rashford, for example, not being part of the English squad, you can see and even get a feel that probably the left wing is not necessarily a priority. Or even if you have, let's say, someone like Foden, who a lot of people like to project to be the left winger of the team, I mean, you'd expect that he also moves central too. So I do think that Saka is a huge focal point of this team. I think he's a great pick. Of course, he's not going to be the penalty taker he usually is, but I still really like him because I think also his minutes should be rather secure as well playing for this English side. Gundogan is a player that I love a lot. You have access to set pieces. You have also a shift in the sort of position that he's occupying within the team as well. Arguably, what Germany are playing now with Toni Kroos coming back is a 4-2-3-1, and that allows Gundogan effectively to play almost as another attacker within that sort of 4-2-3-1 setup. Of course, you have Musiala and Wirtz as well, who are competing and also sort of playing alongside in tandem with Gundogan. But I do like the fact that he's very cheap. And I think that at that sort of price point, at 7 million, you can't really pass up on a player who obviously we would like to say is a very effective player. And of course, maybe Man of the Match awards is something to think about too. Maybe that those will go towards Toni Kroos if there's a little bit of bias there from people who are making decisions like that. But I think Gundogan is an interesting pick and probably has more attacking dividends than, let's say, a Toni Kroos. Xavi Simons, once again, at a ridiculous price point with a good fixture. Keep in mind, of course, as I said, Netherlands group is very tough, but you're just looking at Xavi Simons for match day 1. He is right now a permanent part of this Dutch national team. When you see him at club level, he's obviously an extremely talented player. And ultimately, I think he's got the most routes to fantasy points within this Dutch team. Yes, of course, you have someone like Depay as well, but it's a lot harder, for example, to go into the Depays of the world, even though he's probably the penalty taker of this Dutch national team, just because you have much better competing options in the attacking positions. And then obviously, when you look at, for example, the midfield, yes, there's a lot more competing options, but they're usually blocked by the fact that you might want to prioritize the premiums, as I said, in the forward position. So therefore, I think Xavi Simons, once again, another cheap beast, effectively. Rodri is an interesting one, right? A lot of people are going to be like, Rodri is an auto-pick player. Fair enough. I mean, he might look like an auto-pick player. But I think as a Spaniard as well, just quickly seeing Rodri in the recent games, he might obviously play deep at times, but I think when you watch Rodri play right now, even for example with the Man City team, he is actually, allowed and actually frequently does move into attacking pockets, which obviously differentiates him with, let's say, the Busquets and more traditional defensive mid-type players. Another thing, too, is that he had recently taken the last 2 penalties for Spain. So if you watch the Spain versus Brazil match, he took 2 penalties there. And generally, I really can't see anyone within this team taking penalties away from him. Morata, for example, is notoriously bad at penalties. There's no one else in the team who, maybe with exception to, let's say, Gerard Moreno, who might not even be a part of the squad, who are frequent penalty takers at a club level. So I really like Rodri as a pick simply for that aspect. And of course, when you consider the man of the match aspect too, if let's say Spain are to dominate a game, it's very well going to come through a great performance through probably either Pedri or Rodri, considering that they will be playing in a double pivot in the midfield. And I think that actually does give Rodri some dividends as well. And given the fact that he's so cheap, once again, he gives me all the money I need in the world to get the attackers I want within the forward positions. And Çalhanoğlu, very much a similar situation here. With Turkey, of course, I think one of the issues is that you look at Çalhanoğlu and he's more of a creative player, but at times he can even play effectively a defensive mid position for Turkey. So that's not exactly great for his sort of attacking dividends. But you're looking at also, once again, potential penalty taker for Turkey. And then also just a great matchup here within this unique situation here in match day 1 where you're just focusing on these games. And at that sort of price point for a penalty taker, once again, I'm basically collecting them all for a cheap price, and I'm taking an opportunity here. I think he's also cheaper than Szoboszlai, for example, so I kind of like the opportunity to save a bit more money on another sort of creative player potentially, who ultimately, even if he plays DM, is a penalty taker and can give us a lot of great attacking value. Now, quickly moving on to the forwards here, we have the full trident that I think is extremely expensive, but also consists of 3 out of 4 of the top goal scorers in the tournament when it comes to goal scoring odds. Now, all these players actually have great games in match day 1. I gave you guys the predicted goals for England, for Belgium, for Portugal, and France. And obviously, the one player that I'm missing here is Cristiano Ronaldo. But Cristiano Ronaldo is more expensive than someone like a Romelu Lukaku. And of course, we might not want to draw the comparison between Lukaku and Ronaldo, but ultimately, I think that that cost saving is very important because it does allow me to get Kane and Mbappe as well. What's nice about Kane and Mbappe is that you can alternate captaincies. I suppose the one flaw within this plan here is that my captaincies aren't perfect, right? So we have Kane, who plays on the 16th of June. Mbappe and Lukaku, unfortunately, do play on the same day on the 17th of June. And some people who, might be a little bit more interested in making sure that they have the best captaincies in terms of being able to swap from 14, 15, 16 to 17th of June and as well 18th of June would probably like to have, a Cristiano Ronaldo type player who can actually give you that final match day captaincy. But if I'm being completely honest, I'm struggling to believe here with all the quality picks that we have within this team that we're really going to need to call upon a Portuguese captaincy on that 18th of June game. So I really think that even worst case scenario, right, we've got Çalhanoğlu who can hopefully help us out on the 18th of June. So I'm not too worried about the fact that we don't have perfect captaincy coverage. So that's sort of the plan here. I think Kane brilliant, Mbappe brilliant, and Lukaku, of course, maybe not so brilliant, but the ultimate reality is that for this Belgian national team, he's a huge chance getter for this team, and he's going to be able to be put in positions where he can score a lot of goals, and that's what we want for an easier quote-unquote fixture for Belgium here in match day 1. So that's the team right now. Obviously, as we lay it out to make sure that it's sorted in terms of the day of play, we are actually sort of lining up as a 5-4-1. So we've got Kane as the main man up top, then Saka, Gundogan as the captaincy as well because he plays on the 14th of June, Xavi, Simons, and Rodri as well, and then Mela, Ta, Mittelstadt, Di Lorenzo, Di Marco as well, and Andre Lunin as my goalkeeper. The way it's going to work is, let's say if the Gundogan captaincy doesn't work and it flops, we just simply move on towards probably a DiMarco captaincy on the 15th of June. If that flops, we move on to either a Saka or Kane captaincy on the 16th of June. And if that flops, we go on to the Mbappe captaincy on the 17th of June. And if that flops, we're probably going to stop playing. No, I'm kidding. We'll go with Çalhanoğlu if it really needs to be done. But I'm hoping, obviously, with all the big hitters that we have, all the big hitting teams and players that we have, that we don't have to call upon Çalhanoğlu on the final day of match day 1. So that's going to be my team, my first draft. Let me know what your thoughts are. Clearly, as I said, we're going to be missing out on some key players, right? Probably lack of English defense is a little bit questionable for some people, but as I said, targeting match day 1, I do think Serbia are a pretty competent international team. And if you look at their team, it's definitely top heavy on offense. When you talk about Portugal, I think once again, it's a question of whether you're willing to let go of one of the other premium players within the game. And arguably maybe Lukaku needs to go if you think that that's the player who needs to go for Cristiano Ronaldo. But I think it's also very hard to justify affording it. As far as, let's say, downgrading from Lukaku, I think some people might want to go for Kai Havertz as well, right? Someone who's played exceptionally recently for Arsenal, has of course played left back for Germany, as I did indicate, but will very likely play within a forward position as soon as match day 1 starts. And I think that will be the first sort of iteration of Kai Havertz that we see for this German national team. But as I said, I do really like Lukaku's games. I also think that he's just simply better from a fantasy point of view, given that he's also a penalty taker for Belgium, which is something that obviously gives you that intangible aspect for fantasy point getting. And that's it, really. Thank you guys so much for watching the first video. More content to come soon. We're going to be looking at team analysis. I'll also be giving you guys my predicted lineups for all the big teams and any sort of differentials. And of course, you can expect the midfielders, the forwards, the defenders, and even the goalkeepers and the cheat sheets to all flow through very, very shortly as soon as we get more details around maybe some more differentials and updated squad selections as well from managers. So thank you guys so much, and I'll see you guys soon.